1 second. There we go. All right, so tonight, political power, forms of government, Plato, and then next week we will we'll do the reading and material from John Locke. Political power is the fourth form of power that we're discussing here. The first three, military, ideological, economic power. Political power, finally, then, is the actual exercise of power in the form of political office. So, have you read Plato for this, by the way, because first of all, it's in the book, so it's readily available. Second of all, he does in Republic the service to us of defining the several forms of government that were in existence at the time, and that by and large really sort of still obtain. So with the exception of monarchy, which is probably worth discussing, but the main thing is that by virtue of having this set of definitions, it gives us a way of discussing political power and its various expressions. So as you might be aware, Plato was Greek. And as I mentioned in the first night of class, ancient Athens was the place where we have, at least as recorded in writing that we can read today, a representative democracy of some kind. Now, it's also true that that we begin this sort of brief look about 300 years before Plato was born, because it doesn't just, they don't found the city and begin with a democracy. Instead, the city is actually older than anybody can definitively date, but at about 750 BC, Athens is at that point ruled in the form of an aristocracy. There are 4 tribes within the city, and tribes, remember, are just sort of larger familial groupings. And these 4 tribes, they sort of have agreed to a balance of power among the 4 of them. The heads of the tribes are essentially the co-monarchs of the city-state. But beginning at about 750 BC, they begin to introduce several, what we would call proto-democratic rights, rather than being sort of openly and uniformly and uncategorically democratic. Because there isn't a democracy at this point, and yet there is the realization that the people must have the recognition of their rights to some extent by the government. First of all, they receive common religious rights, which doesn't mean, by the way, they're allowed to practice any religion so much as that they are allowed to practice the Greek religion, and that it's not being particularly prescribed to them from the powers above them, like that they worship a specific god among the Greek pantheon. So you live in Athens, and the patron god of Athens is Athena, the goddess of wisdom, but you're not required to worship Athena if you want to worship Zeus. Instead, you can worship Zeus. So you have that kind of basic religious freedom extended to you. Second thing is inheritance rights. So rather than the government being able to confiscate something upon a person's death, instead they establish within law specific percentages. Of course, this is extended only to men, but there is it takes the shape of a basic form of the recognition of private property. The property doesn't revert back to the state when a person dies. Instead, a person has a right to leave that property to his posterity. And then finally, a possession of common property within each tribe. So there's private property and public property. What they have within the public property realm is the property that's held in common by each tribe, which might be something like, given that it's an ancient society and therefore heavily reliant on farming, it might be a field where they're all allowed to graze their animals. About 600 BC, a man named Solon comes to power in Athens and establishes several new laws beyond the ones that already exist. He banishes debt slavery, for one thing. This won't be permanent, but it's at least something that is still the case when Plato is alive. He also establishes a right to trial by jury, which is essentially really the first time that we see this, at least in a recorded history. And it's something obviously that we still very much consider to be important today. And then last but not least, there is the establishment of an oligarchy. Anybody know what an oligarchy is? Yeah.
A government run by like military power or like a few machines.
So the thing, so sort of. So the part that you have right is that it's ruled by a small group. It's not, doesn't have to be a military group. It doesn't have to be, for that matter, although it's often thought that it would be a group of the wealthy. But rather, it's a group of sort of broadly defined elites. So in this particular case, they happen to be economic elites and military elites because those two things go together. But it won't be like that everywhere, and certainly won't be like that in the model that Plato lays out. So an oligarchy is just basically ruled by people that have elite status for whatever reason. They might have inherited it, they might have earned it to some extent, but what it is not is democratic, and certainly what it is not is monarchy. They introduced democracy finally in 500 BC. So this is direct democracy as opposed to representative democracy, which we have in the United States today, and which most, in fact, you could basically say all democratic countries have, whereas certain jurisdictions might have direct democracy. In ancient Athens, they had it because the population that was eligible to vote was small enough, which meant that rather than people going to polls and electing a person to do their legislating for them, instead they just went to the center in Athens and legislated together because they were a group of usually fewer than 1,000 people that could be involved in doing this. And again, remember that this is because the qualifications for voting were extremely limited. You couldn't vote if you were a woman. You couldn't vote usually unless you were 25 years old. You couldn't vote if you were a slave, and although they had banished debt slavery, they had not banished slavery on the basis of losing in a war, which remains the largest source for slaves in the ancient world. And finally, they have the people that are able to vote have to have some property, which usually means that they have large farms as opposed to being city dwellers. Because when you're a city dweller, you might own the land that your house is on, but that's going to be pretty much it because the population density is much higher, and you're not usually farming, but instead you're plying a trade or something like that. Right? So large farm owners in the Athenian area, and they're able to come in and vote directly on legislation when it comes to pass. And remember, again, this is the same standard that we hold in the United States when we institute our democracy here in 1787. Under our current constitution, the people that can vote is, at that point, just landowning white men who are at least 21 years old. And that there are nearly a dozen changes to the laws over the course of over 200 years to ensure that, that all people, regardless of race, sex, and now age as well as property requirements, are able to vote. But Athens provides at least the model for landowning men. By the way, just as a side question, why would you limit voting to landowning people? I mean, if we sort of take sexism in the ancient world as a given, then we understand why women aren't allowed to vote. And if we take the basic presumption that a slave isn't a free person and only free people can vote, then we accept that too. And then third, we accept that children aren't fully rational and don't have the experience necessary to make an important decision like voting, we can stipulate that as well. But what about property? Why is that something that they believe you have to have in order to vote? Yeah?
Makes you kind of like a part of like the, I don't want to say country, but like area where you're living in.
Well, that's precisely the justification that they give for it. They basically say that unless you own property, you don't have any real skin in the game. You don't have any real stake to lose on the basis of what it is that you're voting on. And, you can get whatever mileage you want out of that particular explanation. It certainly is at least more true in an overwhelmingly agrarian society than it is in an overwhelmingly urban society. but that is the justification. So, as you might have noticed, because of course you all do your reading assiduously, Plato does not write in his own voice, but writes instead in the voice of his teacher, Socrates. So what we know about Socrates, we know from extremely few sources. Basically, 99.9% of the sources that we have on Socrates are Plato, but he does appear in other contemporaneous works by other writers from that period, so we know that he was in fact a real person. He was born in 469 BC, worked as a stonemason, and served in the military during the Peloponnesian War, in which Athens lost to Sparta. So the Peloponnesian War was just one of your basic resource wars in the ancient world, in which two of the major Greek-speaking city-states fought each other, one lost and one won. There was a general kind of agreement when Greeks fought each other that they didn't take slaves from among each other, and so and they didn't destroy each other's cities. Whereas if the Greeks were fighting the Persians or some other group, they would be more than happy to take slaves, kill all the men, destroy the city, so on and so forth. The Greeks held one another to a much higher standard than they held anybody else, which it said is one of the things that distinguished them in the ancient world, although I think you can probably apply that general rule to almost any group of people in the ancient world, that they would treat their own better, people that spoke their language better than they would treat other people. So Socrates begins to fall into legal difficulties late in his life, but it is believed that at least part of this might have come from his abundant praise for Sparta and the way that they did things, as opposed to the way that things were done in Athens. And you can sort of see how that might get you in trouble if you're if one of your most well-known public figures is out there talking about how much he admires the city that you just lost a war to. It would be very much the equivalent of not like Jane Fonda saying that she supports the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War, but President Nixon saying it or President Ford saying it. It would not be something that would go over particularly well. In fact, we would probably consider that to be borderline treasonous. And he believed that because, as I hope comes through in the reading, although based on how much of it you have, maybe not, Socrates was no big fan of democracy, didn't think that it was particularly the best way of running a city. He much more admired the model in Sparta, which was a military aristocracy. How many of you have seen 300? One person has seen 300. Couple people. You should see 300. It's really good. So, what happens to Socrates? Well, he is tried on the charge of corrupting the youth of Athens and is sentenced to death in 399 BC. So I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that Athens was a direct democracy. That means trial by jury was done that way as well. So when Socrates was tried, and Plato records this in his dialogue called the Apology, he records the trial of Socrates and then finally Socrates' sort of closing arguments. The people of Athens, who number at that point of voting ability and who are there, in the like 700 or 800 number, they vote to convict Socrates. It's not required to be unanimous, obviously, because with that many people, it's not likely. But they vote to convict Socrates, and then Socrates has the ability to then make a plea for what his punishment should be. And of course, he knows that the punishment is going to be death because the people have been talking about that all the time. But instead, Socrates makes the argument that he, in fact, should be thanked for what it is that he's done, and that, moreover, he should be given free meals for the rest of his life, and that they should be paid for through the taxes of the city of Athens. And then when the sentencing phase actually is given to the people, they vote in a larger number to execute him rather than the number that had voted merely to find him guilty. So he was not a real popular person either, because on a charge that's essentially a free speech charge in a city that is supposed to be modeling democracy of some kind, even in a topic that is as contentious as backing the your military rival, the idea that he is corrupting the youth by making them think is probably not the best charge that you could bring. But the powers that be were pretty confident in their ability to bring it, or else they probably wouldn't have. And so they got rid of him that way. Plato was born into a pretty powerful family. And he became a follower of Socrates as a young man. So he then, after Socrates dies, he takes a job in government. He travels the world, basically, or the Greek-speaking world at least. He's stationed for a time in Sicily, for instance. And then, as a middle-aged man, he returns to Athens and he opens a school called the Academy, where he begins teaching this Platonic, or this Socratic philosophy, rather, that he learned at the feet of Socrates as a younger man. The question is, well, I'll get there in a minute. So why is so Plato is an extraordinarily important philosophical writer and thinker from an historical perspective. Why? And the answer is basically because of the very large impact that he has on European thinking that comes after him. If he had sort of a bunch of ideas that were rejected, and by the way, he did, then, but there were sort of no ideas that had been preserved, then we probably would have forgotten him or considered him minor, as opposed to considering him to be probably one of the two most important philosophers of the ancient world, the other one being his own student, Aristotle. So we consider him to be important because the early Christian philosophers thought he was important. And it's really for that reason that he becomes an important figure in his own right. And part of what he contributes is the notion that we have now in societies shaped by Christianity, the notion of good and evil. So in the ancient world, very commonly was held the idea that you see more in belief systems like Taoism, or in a small but still extant religion like Zoroastrianism, which was originally practiced in Iran, but today is practiced mainly by small communities in India. This belief that basically evil and good are countervailing forces. It's this ideology called dualism, that you can't have good without evil, and that they in some way balance each other and are necessary and sort of are symbiotic, that they rely on each other for the power of the other. And Plato says that this is wrong. He says that, in fact, if you believe that God is good, and Plato also talked about God singular rather than God's plural, although he didn't, name a particular God that he was thinking of. But he says if God is good, then, and we believe that God created everything, then we have to, logically, by extension, believe that everything that God creates is good, and God creates us, and therefore we're good. And evil, then, isn't the opposite of good. It's just merely the extent to which any individual person or being deviates from the inherent goodness that's within them when God creates them. So by extension, and Christianity still teaches this. This is not, something that went away, and why it's important to understand it that way. Because from the standpoint of Christianity, and again, Christianity shapes European culture in every conceivable way for the next 2,000 years. Even Satan is inherently good by virtue of being created by God. It's just that he is the sort of the paradigmatic example of that being which deviated the most from his inherent goodness. So that's a very different view of good and evil than the one that had come before him. And it doesn't come into sort of amazing widespread belief immediately thereafter, but it does once philosophers like St. Augustine sort of, pick it up and make it Christian and not pagan anymore, and then push it forward in their own writing. So most of Plato's writings are in the form of dialogues, which are sort of like little plays in which Socrates, as the main character, speaks with other people. And Socrates uses what is called, named after him, the Socratic method, in which a series of questions lead his companions to realize that their positions are false. So typically what Socrates will do in a dialogue is he'll be talking to somebody about one of any given topics. For instance, the example I give here, Euthyphro, is the title of one of the shorter and more sort of concise dialogues of Plato. It's usually the one that or the Apology, which, as I mentioned, is the one in which Socrates defends himself and then is sentenced to death. People reading Plato usually start with one of those two because they are relatively simple and relatively short. Usually they're named after the main person with whom Socrates is having his conversation. So, of course, in the Euthyphro, that person is named Euthyphro. And the question that they are discussing is, well, what is holiness? And so Socrates will say to Euthyphro, hey, Euthyphro, I understand that you think you know what holiness is. And Euthyphro says, yeah, of course I know what holiness is. And Socrates says, well, what is holiness then? And Euthyphro says, well, holiness is that which the gods love. And then Socrates begins to say, okay, great, that's a great definition. But what about, and then he begins to sort of chip away at Euthyphro's definition until over the course of, 25 pages or so, he's basically gotten Euthyphro to say that, that it's holy because the gods love it, not that it's holy because it's loved by the god, or that the gods love it because it's holy, inherently holy, rather than it being holy because the gods love it. He actually gets him to sort of state the exact opposite. And then Socrates says, well, is it loved by the gods because it's holy, or is it holy because it's loved by the gods? And Euthyphro says, well, I don't know. And then Socrates says, aha, at least we've gotten to the point where we both realize we don't know. Socrates was sort of big on the idea of conceding your ignorance on big questions. He famously said that he was the wisest man in Athens because he knew that he knew nothing, and that was at least more than most people knew. Now, as you can imagine, most people didn't find that kind of conversation very fun because it doesn't make them look particularly good, and Socrates is kind of always needling people. Before we begin talking about Republic, a question: why do this? Why not just be Plato and write, here's what I think holiness is, or here's what I think justice is, which is the topic of Republic. Why do it in the form of like a little play like this and have Socrates saying all the important things? I mean, Plato actually appears in Apology. He portrays himself, or at least portrays Socrates saying his name. And he appears elsewhere in his own writings as a secondary character. But he could have just as easily just written like Aristotle did and just write down his own thoughts and put them on paper or papyrus or granite or whatever and had people read them. Why put everything in Socrates' mouth? What's the point of that? Yeah.
Because people live less with him, because he's very known.
Right, so on some level he is appealing to Socrates' own previous authority. Now, it's also true, remember, Socrates was not terribly popular. And so there's another motive that people have suspected of Plato of using this particular device, which is to say, yeah.
He's giving him credit.
He's definitely giving him credit. Of that, there's no question. But more importantly, or maybe equally as importantly, he's also making sure that he doesn't get blamed for what it is that Socrates is saying. So if somebody comes to his house and tries to charge him with corrupting the youth of Athens, like Socrates was charged, you can just say, well, I'm not saying it, this is Socrates saying it. Are you going to go to Sophocles' house and charge him with what Oedipus says? Well, if you're not, then you should not charge me with what Socrates says. And remember that Plato was much more politically powerful in his life, and as a result of that, he also had more to lose. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, the topic of Republic is the question, what is justice? In the same way that Euthyphro concerns itself with the topic of what is holiness, here the topic is what is justice. And so to answer the question, Socrates says, well, okay, because they go through the whole rigmarole early in the dialogue where, he is talking with a guy named Thrasymachus, and he says, Thrasymachus, what's justice? And Thrasymachus says something dumb like, well, justice is what the law is. And Socrates, then sort of begins to needle him, but Thrasymachus sees Socrates' game pretty early on, insults Socrates, and then sort of like marches off. But luckily for Socrates, there's two other people there that he can begin to have this succeeding conversation with, one of whom is Glaucon, as mentioned in your book. He says, well, okay, we haven't gotten any closer to understanding what justice is because Thrasymachus has gotten angry and stormed off, but maybe we can continue to talk about this. And rather than me sort of getting you to the point of not admitting you don't know what it is, maybe we can just all admit we don't know what it is, but we can take a case example and we can extrapolate from the example and say, okay, well, this is what justice must be if this is where it's being practiced. So he says, well, what we should do then is we should take the ideal city, look at the qualities of that city, and then more importantly, look at the qualities of the people who lead that city. And on the basis of their qualities, we can conclude what justice is. So, this, by the way, not a great argument, just frankly from Plato's part, because remember, Socrates is not a big fan of democracy. Socrates instead was a great big fan of the military dictatorship that they had in Sparta. So the argument is geared in that direction very much. Further, he has to make a series of arguments that are pretty upsetting in their own right in order to justify the kind of dictatorship that he thinks would be a good one. So important sort of in this kind of in this understanding of political power is remembering, as I've said before, that you don't see the forms of power in isolation. You usually see them in varying amounts combined together. Right? I mean, it's a commonly said thing that the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world. Why is the President of the United States the most powerful person in the world? Well, on the one hand, because the President has the largest and best military, and so military power is a big part of it. But it's also true that the President has what's called a bully pulpit. Right? So when the President, particularly if that President is popular, espouses a particular cause or idea, that can have tremendous persuasive power to get people to support that idea. President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt had that. Ronald Reagan on the other side of the political spectrum had that when he was president. They relied very heavily on sort of good rhetorical power to motivate people in that way. And that's a form of ideological power, when you can motivate people on the basis of ideas. Not to mention then, of course, economic power. The United States is the largest economy in the world, second largest economy in the world, and the largest producer. 25% of all consumption is done by the United States. 30% of all production is done by the United States. That's enormous. We're only outdone by China in terms of the size of a market because China's got 3 times as many people. They'll probably overtake us at some point just because they've been consistently building a highly capitalist system over the course of the last 40 years. But for now, at least, we're the big ones, right? And as I mentioned before, everybody wants United States bonds. We've got a large national debt, as I'm sure that you've heard. I think it's up to $20 trillion. 2 things about that. First of all, that big portion of that national debt is held in United States bonds, which we don't default on, which is why people want them so badly. That's big economic power. And the second thing is, just as a side note, it doesn't cost us very much to service our debt, right? How many of you have a credit card? Right? So you get your credit card bill at the end of the month, right? And you've got what your total balance is, what you charged up that month, what the minimum is that you have to pay for that month, right? We don't have to pay off our national debt all at once. We pay the minimum payment every month. That's all we do. And that doesn't sweat us very much at all because our credit is so good. You know how your minimum payment is based to some extent on what you charged, but it's also based to some extent on what your interest rate is, which is based on your creditworthiness as a consumer. We have the best credit rating in the world, so our interest rate is extremely low. So you're going to hear a lot about this over the course of the next 2 months because you're going to hear Republicans in particular attacking Democrats and talking about how big the national debt is, how Barack Obama ballooned up the national debt, which is true, by the way. I mean, that's not really a disputable fact. The debt went up enormously under Obama. But they're going to say, we have to deal with this problem. And your question should be, really, why? It's not like it's breaking our back. It's not like it has any real impact on the economy. It's a rhetorical device. Remember that about national debt. So, but back to the point at hand, which is that when you have that kind of credit rating, because you're considered to be the strongest economy in the world and therefore the best bet, that's big economic power. So we don't say that the President of the United States is the most powerful person in the world only on the basis of the quality of the United States military. We say it on the basis of a lot more than that. So for any person that holds political power, that's going to be expressed in a combination of these other ways, bearing in mind as well that all of these power forms are in some way reciprocal, that in particular in political power requires bases of power, people who support you in what you're doing as your political process and policy portfolio, right? So if you are a politician from a political party with a bunch of ideas, like, again, use the example of Barack Obama and the Affordable Care Act. He comes into power and seeks to change the health insurance system. He can't do that on his own. He needs to rely on the political power of people in the Congress in both houses that support him. But more importantly than that, he needs the support of the bases of political power for those people who vote for them, and their ability to persuade their own voting bases that it's a good bet. That law squeaked by 3 votes. So clearly it was close. Back to the point at hand. So if you open the book to page 514, this is where make that 522. This is where Socrates and Glaucon begin to talk about the forms of government. But much of what they've discussed up until this point, because as you'll notice, this is book 8 of the Republic from which this has been excerpted, it's 10 books in total, is they've been talking about this, these types of government. And it says 4 types of government, but you can see there's 5 here. So what they've done for the course of the previous 7 books is they've been talking about the ideal form, which is the one on top, which is aristocracy. So now aristocracy, oligarchy are often seen interchangeably. So it's important to make a distinction among a few terms. So I'll make that larger. And let's throw one more into that. Because essentially all of the forms of government, the first 3 forms of government that he lists here are all oligarchies of some kind. They're all ruled by elites. We'll call the top one aristocracy. So, and all of these again are ruled by small groups of people. It's just a matter of who these people are. So, usually when we talk about aristocracy, what we mean is people that have political power on the basis of their station at birth. So that's usually economic, but historically, particularly in Europe, that's meant that you have descended from what's called landed gentry, right? Nobility, people like dukes and earls and lords and all that stuff. And you have had your political power on that basis, and that's been considered to be aristocracy. But the way that Socrates means it here is just sort of like the best people. And what he means by that, we'll get back to in a minute, but for now, he just means the best people. like the highest, literally the highest quality people. And he means this in literally almost like, although they didn't have any idea about genetics, this is like, 2,500 years before Mendel. It's nevertheless important that he sees it as like an inborn trait. Oligarchy is, again, ruled by elites, and those elites can be constituted in any particular way. Plutocracy is ruled by the wealthy. Now, so there tends to be a lot of use of the second two interchangeably, which is why it's sort of preferable to use plutocracy, because there can't be any mistake about what that means. Plutocracy is only ever ruled by the wealthy. Now, because there's a lot of interchangeability between the wealthy and elites, or the wealthy and the best people, again, it's important to understand what those terms mean. So, in talking about this ideal society, this ideal city-state, throughout most of this dialogue, Socrates says that the best type of government is the one on top. It's this aristocracy, this rule by the best people. And who he means by the best people are these people that he calls philosopher kings. Philosopher kings, he says, are the most ideal people in any society on the basis of a combination of their physical ability and their intellectual ability. So philosopher in terms of the intellect, king in terms of the sort of the more ancient idea of a king being mostly a military leader. And he says these people are the best people because they've maximized the sort of the two most important qualities that human beings have, physical ability and mental ability, and therefore they're best suited to lead. And he says, and what's nice about that is that people that have maximized those two things, they seek justice, which means that their reasons for ruling will only be to advance the cause of justice. And that's how we'll know the ideal city. So on some level, there's almost like a utopian aspect to what Socrates talks about when he talks about this ideal society that he imagines in that top row. Which is to say, he truly believes that this could be done, but, he also recognizes that and if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. So first of all, he says, well, there would have to be a minimum physical ability that everybody that was in this class of people who were suitable to rule would have to meet. And so they would be mostly not women, although some women, clearly, if they could qualify, would be able to be in there as well. And second of all, he says, well, it's also important then that we identify at the youngest possible age the most intelligent children, and we track them within this particular line to make sure that they understand justice, that they understand, pursuit of the highest excellence and all these other things. Which means that a few things. First of all, he believes that they need to all be raised in common rather than being raised by individual parents. So he sees it as like a communal way of raising children. He also makes an argument in there someplace, basically, that a child that is that has no potential to maximize or even minimize his or her physical strength to be useful to society should just basically be left on the far side of the mountain. And further, he says that the educational level that we'll give to everybody within that society is going to be commensurate with what it is that they're supposed to do. So the best education goes to the philosopher kings. He says, there'll be like a group below them, like vice philosopher kings, and we'll give them like the second best education. And then there'll be everybody else, and we'll give them basically the kind of education that we feel like they deserve. Which is, he says, we'll teach them not to question what it is that we are doing here in engineering the society to be the way that it is. He says, what we'll teach them is that the philosopher kings, they've got like a core of their body that consists of gold. We'll tell them that the second echelon, like the second best people, those people have like silver, and then everybody else the hoi polloi, the common people, they've got like bronze. And you can move from bronze to silver or from silver to gold. You can't move from bronze to gold, so that your thoughts about sort of where you can aspire in life are going to be, nice and limited. So I mention this because Socrates recognizes that political power like this is intertwined with the other forms of power, particularly military power, because he sees them as being both, physical warriors as well as intellectual elites, as well as ideological power. In order to get people to buy this, you have to sell them on an ideology, and that means you have got to get them as children. You've got to educate them in this manner. Remember that we talked about James the First last week, and I had mentioned it to you then. It's worth repeating. He was a true believer in the idea that he was divinely destined to be the monarch of Scotland and then subsequently of England. He believed that because they'd been telling him that since he was 6 months old. Nobody telling him any different or teaching him to question whether that was really true or not. Do that with the whole society. So it's one of the reasons why you see in societies that are totalitarian a very strong emphasis on sort of laying down what literally the party line is, the beliefs of the political party that run a society like that, what those beliefs are to the youngest possible children, and then keep it going throughout all of their compulsory education. That comes from Plato. That's Plato's basic understanding of the key purpose of education. And, he wasn't wrong on that, because the things that you learn as a child are the things you're going to sort of hold most dearly, particularly if you're not taught any way of rationally dissecting whether that's a good idea or not. Now, Plato's also, can I help you?
I throw my water bottle.
That's okay. Anybody find a water bottle?
It's like, I said up in there. Sorry.
That's all right. So he says, this is going to be hard, right? I mean, because sometimes you're going to make mistakes in picking the best people. You'll promote somebody up to the top that isn't solely focused on justice. So they begin talking about the other forms of government on page 522. Now, this discussion begins with, okay, well, if we can't have an aristocracy of philosopher kings, then what is the second best form of government? And they come to the conclusion that the best form of government is what is called the second best form of government. And in fact, the best form of government in existence is what's called timocracy. In timocracy, Socrates tells them, this is when the military rules. And what's good about this is that in having military rule, what they seek, which isn't as good as justice, but it's almost as good as honor. And so if you've got a military elite running your society whose primary concern is honor, you won't have the ideal society, but you'll have a good society. It'll be pretty good. This is Sparta's model, by the way. Right, so Socrates doesn't believe that Sparta has, philosopher kings running it, but he does believe that they've got a better society than they've got in Athens, because in Athens you've got a democracy. Look, that's second from the bottom. In Sparta they've got timocracy. That's like the second best. But again, he recognizes that there are problems there as well. So Socrates says, okay, well, so how can timocracy be ruined? And he says, well, here's how it can be ruined. So we've got a society, a timocracy, where it's run by the military and they're seeking honor. But not everybody in the military seeks honor. Some of them just seek wealth. Right? Because remember, in the ancient world, when you go out and you fight a war, part of the incentivizing that you get to do that is that when you really kick ass and you destroy a place, anything that you want to take from that place can be yours. And so, Julius Caesar was the wealthiest man in the world when he became the leader of Rome, and that was because he'd been a general for years and years before. It if you were good at it and therefore won and didn't lose, it was a pretty good way to make yourself fantastically rich. So, but Socrates says that's a problem, because ultimately there's going to be a tipping point where you're no longer going to have a majority of the people who are running your society who are interested in honor, with the minority being interested in wealth. Instead, he says you're going to have a majority interested in wealth and a smaller percentage that are interested in honor. And at that point, basically what will happen is that the society will transform, and the form of government will transform, importantly, into the next highest level, which is mislabeled here actually as oligarchy, but really we should call it plutocracy, ruled by the wealthy. And of course what they seek is wealth, is money. Now already, there's an inkling of what might possibly be wrong here, and Socrates acknowledges this and says, clearly greed is not a good thing. An underlying assumption of capitalism is that pursuit of wealth is a good thing because it makes the pie higher, as President Bush used to say. It creates more wealth in the process, and that means that the bottom level for everybody goes up, that there's more goods for everybody to consume. So therefore, on some level, to be greedy is a positive process. But Socrates says greed for its own sake is not good, and that therefore it's really important that we sort of prevent government from coming in that is wealthy and that just pursues more wealth. But he says this creates also its own problems, which is that in a wealth-oriented society in which the wealthy are already running things, and they're running things with the goal of getting wealthier, then what happens? He says, well, what happens is you get more and more poor people and fewer rich people. And at some point, that tips as well, he says. At some point, the number of people that are poor will be so numerous and they will be so deprived and so angry at the wealthy that they'll just rise up in revolution and overthrow the wealthy, and they'll take power. And then that, Socrates says, is when you have democracy. So democracy then is ruled by the people, but the way that Socrates sees it is really mob rule. Now he says that they've got their own way of doing things, right? Democracy is ruled by the people, and he says they want freedom, which basically for Socrates means the freedom to do anything that you want to do, which he sees as being almost inherently designed to descend into anarchy, which he says, of course, it does. Right? It says, democracy comes into being after the poor have conquered their opponents, slaughtering some and banishing some, while to the remainder they give an equal share of freedom and power, and this is the form of government in which the magistrates are commonly elected by lot, that they are voted in. Yes, Glaucon says, that is the nature of democracy, whether the revolution has been effected by arms or whether fear has caused the opposite party to withdraw. And now, what is their manner of life, and what sort of a government have they? For as the government is, such will be the man, clearly, Glaucon says. In the first place, are they not free? And is not the city full of freedom and frankness? A man may say and do what he likes. So, Glaucon. And where freedom is, the individual is clearly able to order for himself his own life as he pleases, clearly. Then, in this kind of state, there will be the greatest variety of human natures, their will. This then seems likely to be the fairest of states, being like an embroidered robe which is spangled with every sort of flower. And just as women and children think a variety of colors to be of all things most charming, so there are many men to whom this state, which is spangled with the manners and characters of mankind, will appear to be the fairest of states. Glaucon agrees. Yes, my good sir, and there will be no better in which to look for a government. Why? Glaucon says. Because of the liberty which reigns there, they have a complete assortment of constitutions, and he who has a mind to establish a state as we have been doing must go to a democracy to a bazaar, which they sell them and pick out the one that suits him. Then, when he has made his choice, he may have found his state. He will be sure to have patterns enough. And there being no necessity, I said, for you to govern the state, even if you have the capacity or to be governed unless you like, or to go to war when the rest go to war, or to be at peace when others are at peace, unless you are so disposed, there being no necessity also because some law forbids you to hold office or be a die-cast person ruling. That you should not hold office or be a die-cast if you have a fancy. This is not a way of life which for the moment is supremely delightful for the moment, yes. Now, if you're reading very very soft here. The problem is that he says, well, he then intimates what's really bad about that, which is he says, well, if everybody can just, rule over themselves because they've got so much freedom, then, if a war comes along, how are you going to raise an army? If you need to pass a tax, how are you going to collect the money? And that will be as destabilizing a problem as having no law at all. So he says there'll be like a downward spiral when this happens, with the end result, he says, that the people will finally throw up their hands and say, we need something to bail us out here. We need a hero to stabilize the situation. It's actually 525. Or the bottom of 524. Every time. It's actually, so it's page 524, it is about a third of the way down the page. I was going to observe that the insatiable desire of this and the neglect of other things introduced the change in democracy which occasions a demand for tyranny. How so? When a democracy which is thirsting for freedom has evil cupbearers presiding over the feast, and has drunk too deeply of the strong wine of freedom, then, unless her rulers are very amenable and give a plentiful draught, she calls them to account and punishes them and says they are cursed oligarchs. Yes, he replied, a very common occurrence. Yes, I said, and loyal citizens are insultingly termed by her, quote, slaves, who hug their chains, and men of naught she would have her subjects who are like rulers, and rulers who are like subjects. These are men after her own heart, whom she praises and honors both in public and private. Now in such a state can liberty have any limit? No, Glaucon says. By degrees, the anarchy finds a way into private houses and ends by getting among the animals and infecting them. Glaucon doesn't understand, so he continues. The father grows accustomed to descend to the level of the sons and to fear them, and the son is on the level of the father by having no respect or reverence for either of his parents. This is his freedom. And the medic is equal with the citizen, and the citizen with the medic, and the stranger is quite as good as either. Yes, Glaucon says that is the way. And these are not the only evils. I said there are several lesser ones. In such a state of society, the master fears and flatters his scholars, and he goes on sort of like this, all these classic master-servant relationships become inverted. And the sort of the proper order of things is upset. The last extreme, he says finally, of popular liberty is when the slave bought with money, whether male or female, is just as free as his or her purchaser. Nor must I forget to tell of the liberty and equality of the two sexes in relation to each other. Harder. Women will act like men and men like women. Cats and dogs living together. So, such, he says at the bottom of that page, my friend, I said, is the fair and glorious beginning out of which springs tyranny. So he says, tyranny is the final stage of this evolutionary process, wherein so much misery and destabilization of society is wrought by democracy that the people decide to elect one of their own or to suspend or elevate one of their own above them to restore order. And this, Socrates says, is the worst form of government. This hero that they appoint in order to lead them, he says, will be concerned only for power's own sake, for the sustenance of his own power. Which means that he'll do anything to remain in power. It doesn't matter what the consequences might be. So he says he will alienate the people, and people will hate him, and they'll want to get rid of him, so he'll go to war. Because Socrates realizes, and Plato in writing this realizes, and it's as true now as it was then, that a great way to galvanize a society around its leadership is to have a war. Because then the focus of your animosity is toward the outsider rather than toward one another or toward your leaders. And because the city's so poorly managed, because the leader is so incompetent, in going to this war, he'll lose. And then that's the end. That's the end of the city. Right? The men are killed, the women are raped and enslaved, the children are enslaved, and that's it. So basically what Socrates is saying is, well, okay, so you can do it like my way, or ultimately you're going to have some part of this process that ultimately leads in destruction. So what are you going to choose? So it's both a it's both a dialogue, Republic that is seeking to say something about the topic of justice, but it is also prescribing a particular way of doing things. But as I mentioned, that way of doing things requires all kinds of things that history has actually shown us are kind of negative. You know, like mass brainwashing, which is basically the kind of education that Socrates wants to be instituted in this society. Because if you've got a majority of people with no power, and that's basically what he's saying, then the way to make them accept that is by making sure that they have been really well propagandized and really well taught the right way to think. So, and as I mentioned, you know, there is the idea of children being raised without parents. There's the idea of infanticide in Republic. So you know, it's a mixed bag to say the least. What's kind of remarkable about it, though, is that while history has shown that the parts about education, particularly with that sort of brainwashing aspect of education, how potentially very destructive those things can be, he's also sort of shown a really good sense of the way that this kind of process, particularly from plutocracy, the third one, rather than oligarchy, the way that descends from plutocracy into democracy, into tyranny, and then into destruction. And it's really, you know, it's probably not an accident that later philosophers like Marx, who view history as a sort of a logical process of development, were big readers of philosophy and therefore had read Plato and probably saw this, and they just sort of drew the same lines that he did as being observers of the cycles and the patterns in history. You can, for instance, sort of look at the bottom three rungs as being, and actually even the second to the top, democracy. Because democracy, when you think about it, really is what monarchy in Europe was for hundreds of years. It is just the military ruling things, because there's really no distinction in medieval society right through to the modern period in Europe between political power and military power. It's basically the same thing. Once there is the entree into considerations of power of wealth, you get a situation like what happens in the French Revolution. So France has a monarchy for 1,000 years, but really sort of beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, there is a increasing focus on wealth, and then with that increasing focus on wealth, there is an increasing division between the rich and the poor. So that a very small number of people have a tremendous amount of wealth, and a very large number of people have very little. And when finally something happens like, they run out of bread in the store because, nobody's been minding the system by which you're supposed to get bread into the stores and make sure people can afford it. On top of that, everybody sort of throws their hands up, and the people revolt, and they overthrow the government, and they institute a democracy. But if you know anything about the French Revolution, you know how well that went. Which is to say, it did not go particularly well. It lasted about 11 years, and then it pretty much fell apart. And it fell apart, at least in part, not so much over the pursuit of freedom, but at least over the solution that Plato prescribed for, or said that people in a democracy will seek out, which is the elevation of a hero. Right? In 1799, the French elevate Napoleon Bonaparte over the French society to stabilize a situation that had been badly destabilized for a decade at that point. And then what does he do? He goes to war. You can do that sort of over and over again through several different revolutionary scenarios that rise, probably even going back further than that, but definitely with the French Revolution. So The last thing I want to cover with you guys tonight is this thing, the allegory of the cave, which is what is covered in the book on page 519 and following, on shadows and reality in education.